So now that we've grounded this in issues of broadband and opioids and entrepreneurship in one of the poorest states in the country, we're going to take that case study and have Victor put it in context and what's going on across the country. So Victor Hwang is the Vice President of Entrepreneurship at the Kauffman Foundation. I've been fortunate to work with Victor on this access to capital work over the last year, and we're grateful to Kauffman for being a co-host of this. What Victor is going to do is take examples like Core 10 or the Lily's Place founder and put them in context of the barriers that we see entrepreneurs facing across the country and what government and economic development can do. And then we're going to talk to some actual entrepreneurs afterwards. So Victor, great to have you with us and looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you to Ross and the Village Capital team, and thanks to Barry and Sarah at the Open Markets team for this amazing event. This is what a revolution looks like at the beginning, and it's really cool to be part of it. So I'm going to share a few thoughts first, and then we'll bring up some entrepreneurs to talk about their personal experiences. But I wanted to start just by providing some perspective on where we are. Everyone deserves a fair shot. That's the promise of America. A fair shot means that you should get a level playing field, no matter your skin color, your zip code, who your parents are, where you went to school, or how much money you started with in your pocket. A fair shot means that you can take an idea, work hard, and turn that idea into wealth, new jobs, and new opportunity. That's what entrepreneurs do. America was built on the fundamental right to have a fair shot to make, do, and dream of a better future. That spirit inspired the colonists in the Boston Tea Party, who were mostly entrepreneurs, to fight for the right to sell their products against the monopoly of the East India Company. That spirit drove Mr. Ewing Kauffman in 1950 to start a business in his basement with $5,000, eventually growing it into a business worth $6 billion in 1989, and transforming the lives of 2 million people in the Kansas City region and touching millions more lives elsewhere. His legacy is the Kauffman Foundation, where we believe that everyone, no matter who you are or where you're from, has a right to take an idea and turn it into a business with zero barriers in the way. Today, the notion of a fair shot is under threat. The Kauffman Foundation commissioned a survey that found that 79% of entrepreneurs believe government incentives favor big businesses over small ones. And the data show that entrepreneurs are struggling. According to the Nonpartisan Economic Innovation Group and others, we're in a long-term decline in entrepreneurial activity. In 1980, nearly half of American firms were 5 years old or younger. By 2015, that rate had fallen to 1/3. Today, for the first time in 4 decades, businesses are closing about as fast as they're starting. America has institutionalized a bias towards big. That bias favors existing companies and accumulated wealth. It favors certain slivers of America over the broader welfare. As a result, our big shiny cities are bigger and shinier than ever in many ways. Meanwhile, we see inequality in struggling small towns, disinvested urban neighborhoods, and rural areas. We see persistent pockets of poverty and a growing sense of disempowerment and disconnectedness. Over the last 2 years, since moving back to the Midwest, I've traveled to many of these places, and I've seen the contradiction firsthand. In Mr. Kauffman's birth town of Garden City, Missouri, population 1,630, citizens can't even buy fresh produce. America may be glittering at the top, but it's struggling at the bottom. We are a fair distance from a fair shot. The inequalities are stark. Half of net new American businesses started in recent years were in just 5 of the biggest metro areas. When small businesses need capital, many reach out to banks, but large banks have become larger, and small and medium-sized banks, who are more likely to back new businesses in smaller markets, are disappearing. The smallest community banks have declined 41% since 2008. Today, only 18% of new businesses get a bank loan. On the other end of the spectrum, high-growth tech businesses turn to venture capital, but only 0.6% of businesses ever raise venture capital, and it's highly concentrated. Over 80% goes to 3 states. In past studies, less than 2% went to women, less than 1% went to underserved founders of color, and less than 1% went to rural areas. This year at the Kauffman Foundation, we've analyzed the barriers entrepreneurs face accessing capital, and we'll publish a report later this fall. The bottom line, we've found that 81% of new businesses don't access any type of formal financing, critical resources they might need to have a fair shot. While our attention is focused on the big players, entrepreneurs often die deaths by 1,000 cuts. I'll give you a simple story. The father of one of my team members at the Kauffman Foundation considered starting a business years ago. He faced the challenge of completing the required forms and fees, working with lawyers and accountants. In the end, however, the cost and complexity was just too much, and the gentleman never started his business. The American economy died a small death that day, just as it does every time a potential entrepreneur is deterred by a barrier that doesn't need to be a barrier. Some entrepreneurs face even greater barriers, since 29% of jobs require a government-issued license, a big increase from 40 years ago when only 10% of workers were licensed. These requirements mean fewer practitioners and stifle new entrepreneurs. So now, the good news. Entrepreneurship is becoming a proven tool to address some of our biggest economic challenges. The research evidence is more and more compelling. For instance, we know that all net new job creation comes from new businesses, not old ones. Old businesses tend to shed jobs. New businesses tend to create jobs. But you wouldn't know that from the way cities do economic development today. In a famous example, 238 cities competed to win Amazon's second headquarters and its promised treasure of 50,000 jobs. But the surprising truth is that new businesses in a single city can make far greater impact than Amazon. For example, in Kansas City, startups created 84,000 jobs from 2012 to 2016. That's far more jobs than Amazon ever offered. Entrepreneurship is a pathway open to every city in the nation to grow jobs, not just for one anointed city. Entrepreneurship even helps combat poverty. For every 1% increase in the rate of new businesses started in a state, there's a 2% decline in the poverty rate. For decades, economic development has focused on the top, attracting and retaining a region's biggest employers. Now, we need to reinvent economic development, focusing on entrepreneurs at the bottom. Bottom-up economic development is about empowering individuals to start and grow businesses that can turn into the wealth, jobs, and opportunity of the future. We are discovering practical ways to do that. We hosted a summit this summer that convened over 600 people, including over 100 mayors, who are implementing practices to grow their entrepreneurial communities. And we've published an online playbook that walks people through steps required to grow their own communities supporting entrepreneurship. The real debate is this: how do we build an economy that empowers the little guys and gals and gives them a fair shot? Well, let's think about who the ideal customer is. Who deserves our time, attention, and tax dollars? Do we focus on society's biggest players or the littlest ones? Do we focus on existing companies who reduce jobs over time or new companies who create jobs? Do we reward economies of scale that often become too big to fail or empower those too small to succeed? Do we measure our economic well-being by the Dow Jones Industrial Average of the 30 largest companies or by the broad-based dynamism of our entrepreneurial spirit? In terms of making policy, can we reverse our lens? To create a blueprint for bottom-up economic development, let's ask some what-ifs. What if we focus on the little things that matter to millions of entrepreneurs instead of the big things that matter to a handful of big players? What if starting a business required 0 forms and 0 fees? What if the energy that 238 cities expended on the Amazon HQ2 contest was invested instead into building their own entrepreneurs and innovators? What if more workforce training dollars were dedicated to help people start and grow their own businesses instead of just teaching employees to fill roles in existing businesses? What if public school systems were redesigned to teach students how to make jobs, not just take jobs? What if borrowing $30,000 to start or grow a new business was easier than borrowing $30 million to grow a big one even bigger? What if antitrust laws were rewritten so that empowering entrepreneurial innovation was just as worthy a goal for our economy as lowering consumer prices? Finally, what if we confronted the biggest barriers of all? Apathy and cynicism. Apathy is dangerous. America's problems are too big, so nothing I do matters. Cynicism is deadly. There's nothing that can be done because nothing ever works. We cannot let apathy and cynicism win. Yes, it's hard to revive struggling communities, but that's no reason to think that we're at the end of the American experiment, that the last great hope on earth will fade. There is a solution. Entrepreneurship is a proven, practical way to empower individuals and renew our economy from the bottom up. We can no longer overlook entrepreneurs as an engine of economic development. We support this conference today because we believe in the makers, doers, and dreamers everywhere. Today, we'd like to announce a tangible goal. In the next 5 years, the Kauffman Foundation will support programs that help 200,000 entrepreneurs start and grow their businesses, and we will strengthen 200 communities nationwide to create pro-entrepreneur programs, policies, and practices. We can't do this alone. We welcome your support in joining us. If you've got a novel idea on how to help entrepreneurs, we want to know. Great things start small. Mr. Kauffman started in his basement. Steve Jobs started in his garage. Oprah started on a local radio station in Tennessee. And someone somewhere today, maybe in a small town, maybe in their bedroom, maybe with a few bucks saved over the years, is testing out a new widget, a new recipe, or a new design, and is starting their entrepreneurial journey. He or she isn't seeking favors. He or she just wants a chance. He or she deserves a fair shot, just like every entrepreneur does. Let's make it our task to provide it. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to invite our entrepreneurs on the stage. So one of the things I always want to do is to get the real voices of entrepreneurs in the room, because so often they're talked about, but actually not talked with. So come on board, guys. So pleased to introduce our entrepreneurs here today. We have Mike Callicrate on the end. He's a farmer rancher, business entrepreneur, and family farm advocate. His expertise on the consequences of industrial meat production has been widely sought. Been an advisor on the films Food, Inc. and Fresh, and best-selling books like Fast Food Nation, Omnivore's Dilemma. He started farming and ranching in St. Francis, Kansas. In 2000, he formed Ranch Foods Direct, a branded beef company and retail online food store in Colorado Springs. Rodney Foxworth, who's executive director of the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. He's a nonprofit leader and social entrepreneur, executive director of BALL, a network of the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, a network of entrepreneurial leaders advancing equitable economic opportunities through entrepreneurship and local business in marginalized communities. Previously, CEO and founder of Invested Impact, focused on economic development, philanthropy, and social innovation. Alex Laskey, co-founder of O-Power, was the president and founder of a software company that partners with utilities to engage their customers to drive large-scale, measurable and verifiable reductions in energy use. To date, O-Power has delivered more than $2 billion in energy savings in partnership with more than 100 utilities in 16 countries. Started it from a 2-person startup to a 600-person publicly traded company before selling it to Oracle. And Lillian Salerno. Lillian is a medical device entrepreneur and a rural advocate, was the former Deputy Undersecretary for Rural Development at the Department of Agriculture, and the Administrator for Rural Business and Cooperative Services, and on the White House Rural Opioid Epidemic Task Force. She was previously COO of Retractable Technologies and has worked as an attorney. And she ran for the Democratic nomination in a congressional race this year as well. Pleased to have you guys here with us. So I'll start with a question for Lillian, sitting next to me here. So you and your partner invented a life-saving medical device, an automatically retracting syringe. This was during the height of the AIDS crisis, would have prevented accidental sticks and helped lessen the fear around treating AIDS patients. You were given a sizable grant from the government to continue to develop and grow your business, but the business was unable to take off. So what happened in your entrepreneurial story?
Well, I just happened to bring a syringe, so you know what we're talking about. So our story's been covered a lot. So the part that I'd like to focus on is what happened next and when we went to get relief. So we invented a retractable syringe back then, when people had HIV, they all died and nurses were scared to treat them. The government gave us a SBIR grant so that needle sticks could be prevented so that people would treat AIDS patients. And so we came up with the world's first retractable syringe. I'm just going to show it. I normally don't do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And it retracts after you inject the patient. And that should have been the standard of care for the whole world. It could have saved hundreds of lives. We have a very small market share. And the reason we do is we were up against the monopolists. We fought them for 20 years. We still fight them every day. But the thing that I think is important for the people in this room is to know what happens when you do go to your government and ask for relief. what the FTC does tell you. So I got to give you this just real quick, if you don't mind, Victor. When you go to the government, when you go to the FTC and you show them that these guys have been beating up on you for 20 years, that they don't innovate, that they send products into federal facilities that don't work, that in the middle of the H1N1 epidemic, they weren't able to make supply, and that we were the only other producer in the entire country. When you hear from the FTC folks, guess what they tell you? That's not our job. Our job is to make sure that when a company survives and they go up against the big guys and they get a settlement, we go in and we make sure the American consumer gets a piece of that settlement. That's not their job. Their job is to protect what I believe is an endangered species, the small business person in this country, the entrepreneur in this country that's not on the West Coast in New York or Silicon Valley. That's the FTC's job. But we don't hold them accountable, and so we don't get relief. So we're an endangered species, small business. And right now, the way they look at it like they've been put in charge as a wildlife. They're the guy that's supposed to take care of wildlife, the rhino. And some poacher, the monopolist, comes and takes out the rhino. They go in and eat some of the meat. That's what they think their job is. Their job is to protect the rhino, and that's the small business. And that's what we need to demand from our government officials.
I love that analogy of the endangered species and the culling of endangered species for the benefit of the kill. Now, Mike, to speak from your ranching background, by all accounts, the movement to eat locally is growing strong, and there's a lot of people who love to buy direct from their farmers and ranchers. Yet, under the surface, your business and others like yours are facing significant challenges from consolidated and vertically integrated agribusiness. What barriers do you see the small farmers and ranchers dealing with from large incumbents, and how do those compare with the challenges startups face in the ag sector?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Victor. I could make the argument that the local food movement is over. There is a lot of interest. I mean, the recall that we had last week of nearly 7 million pounds from our meat monopolist, JBS, our Brazilian company. People do really want to know where their food comes from. The problem is the people who really control the food industry have co-opted the local message. In Colorado Springs, for example, when I try to access the University of Colorado Springs, we used to sell them ground beef. We don't anymore. We've been replaced by a brand called Aspen Ridge. Aspen Ridge is a phony pretend brand of JBS, the company that had the recall last week, the biggest meat packer in the world. Another customer, the former customer for Ranch Foods Direct, is now using a brand name called Gold Canyon, another phony pretend brand from JBS. And the big barrier, I think, to companies like Ranch Foods Direct who want to sell in the wholesale institutional market is a problem with just basic market power of Cisco. Cisco being our biggest food service company in the country, and they're aligned and work with the biggest food management companies in the country, which is Compass, Sodexo, and Aramark, and you cannot penetrate that market. The kickbacks are too big, the under-the-table payments are too big, and they're buying below cost of production from other countries that now can ship into this country from companies like JBS. Now Marfrig, our fourth largest packer, is a Brazilian company as well in the beef industry. And they're buying product 30 to 50% below cost of production and dumping it into this country. And as it crosses the border, they are able to put product of the USA on that product as it's distributed throughout the system. So that's what I come up against as a meat company in Colorado Springs. It has never, ever been harder. And I have been in business with Ranch Foods Direct now for 18 years, and we have cut for other people. One of our missions is to raise income. Our main mission is to raise income at the farm and ranch gate and facilitate as many other people accessing that market as possible by providing them access to our infrastructure of processing and distribution and packaging and so forth. No one is making it. Not a single label, not a single rancher is profitable, has made it in this monopolized, fully controlled food system. So I say break them up.
That idea of market power, Mike, is sort of, we talked about this before, the bargaining power of big companies sort of overweights the non-collective bargaining power of entrepreneurs. Now, Alex, you had an interesting story because you were actually very successful in working with entrenched utility companies with your company, Opower. What was the difference? How were you able to actually work with entrenched companies to actually create a new business?
Sure. Thanks for having me on this panel. I think there is one response which I am very sympathetic to and I think is appropriate in a lot of industries, which is to take the monopolists and break them up. There are other industries for which monopolies exist, and you could argue, I think, quite effectively that they are natural monopolies, and I would argue that the distribution utility business is one of those industries. Just to put it in perspective, the utility grid, depreciated, is worth roughly $2 trillion, but to fully replace it would cost around $5 trillion. So we have this incredibly valuable piece of machinery, complicated, that mostly works well across the country. And so you could say, well, let's break that up, and there are people who would argue that. But I think there's quite a bit of history now to suggest that the utilities, that is to say, privately held but publicly regulated utilities, can and do act in the public interest, and in doing so, create opportunities for entrepreneurs. And I'll tell my story briefly in the context of a very brief history of what I think of utilities doing the right thing. I'm not here to defend all utilities and their actions or all utility executives. Not all of them are good people doing well by the world. But just some context here. In 1907, the state of Wisconsin legislature passed the Public Utility Act, which mandated that utilities not only provide electricity to wealthy people living in Madison and Milwaukee, but to everybody in between as well. And that became sort of the de facto, it passed it across several states and became the sort of de facto reality. We don't have electric companies, although they're privately held, that just skip about and serve only wealthy communities. They serve everybody. And we think of electricity as a right in this country at this point. It wasn't in 1907. The Hoover Dam opened in 1935, again, result of public intervention, but with private sector actors, and provided folks like Mike or people living in the Colorado River Valley reliable, inexpensive electricity to grow their businesses. And this has happened time and time again. In this century and in the last 30 years, the emphasis increasingly is not just on providing reliable and inexpensive electricity to American consumers and businesses, but decarbonizing it and reducing the carbon impact of our grid. And as a specific example of that, where it started roughly, is in 1982 in California. The California legislature and then the California Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission decided we're going to reward our privately traded utilities for pursuing energy efficiency. And we're going to require that they, before they build any new supply, that they go after and help their customers save energy, and will allow them to earn a greater return on their costs, a greater profit if they help their customers save energy. In 1982, when that policy started, the average electric usage in California was 7,000 kilowatt hours per household. In Texas, in 1982, the average usage was also 7,000 kilowatt hours. We've now had 35 years of energy efficiency policy in California, and usage remains 7,000 kilowatt hours in spite of the fact that the economy has grown substantially and people's standard of living has increased tremendously. In those 35 years, usage has remained constant thanks to energy efficiency policies. In Texas, which went in a different direction and advocated competition and no codes and standards and no regulation. Those 35 years has meant more than a doubling in electric usage. It's now 15,000 kilowatt hours per household in Texas. So this is just to lay the groundwork for how public policy can shape monopolists' action to pursue something that is in the public interest. What it meant for an entrepreneur like us, like my partner and I, when we started the business a decade ago, was that we could go around the country and find that utilities increasingly, through different mechanisms designed by their state legislatures and their public utilities commissions, were pursuing energy efficiency and helping their customers save. And utilities, they're good at a lot of things, but innovating programs for their customers is not something that they do in-house. And so we were able to approach them with novel technologies. We were able to access venture capital funding. We raised money. And we grew, as you described, to a company that employed more than 600 people, served utilities in 15 countries, generated a lot of wealth for a lot of people, and most importantly, the thing I'm most proud of, we've now to date saved consumers more than $2.5 billion on their energy bills, which is then going to other things that people need in their lives. And we wouldn't have been able to build this business were it not for monopolies progressively regulated and trying, not because they're good people, not because they're bad people, but trying because incentives have been put in their way to pursue the public interest. And utilities in this country spend roughly $8 billion a year on energy efficiency. Some of it is spent well, some of it is spent poorly. But there's a market there for other entrepreneurs, and there are thousands of entrepreneurs who are helping build businesses, some of them small businesses, to help utilities achieve that. I'm not here to say monopoly is good. I don't believe that. But I do think that when we think about what is this, and I know there's a panel later today about the solutions, but when we think about combating monopoly power, we should be thinking just as much about good regulation as we are about as breaking them up.
I think the interesting thing about that story is how public policy actually created the markets that enabled your business to thrive and impact end consumers. Now, Rodney, you're in the business of actually trying to empower entrepreneurs more. So empowering local economies, building systems like cooperatives and microloan programs and rural business networks. Can you give us some examples of what's working, like how some of your Ball Fellows work addresses some of these concerns we're talking about?
Yeah, so let me also just really quickly acknowledge how real and direct this conversation's been. I'm really appreciative of the comments and really getting to the heart of the matter. So I just want to thank my fellow panelists for that, because oftentimes we have these conversations, we're kind of stepping on sort of avoiding eggshells and all that sort of thing. So, so that said, I want to recognize a couple of things that's already been mentioned in some of the prior comments as well. Particularly the question around innovation and stymieing innovation in rural communities. So at Bali, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, about 20%, actually a little bit over 20% of our network is made up of entrepreneurs, innovators from rural America, and also in Canada as well. And not surprisingly for folks in this panel, and hopefully not for those in the audience, there is incredible innovation happening at the really local level that's occurring. So a quick example of that, Victor, is last year I was privileged to have an opportunity to visit DeWitt, Arkansas, in central Arkansas, a small town about 3,000 people. And the mayor there was talking a lot about how he would rather have 10 businesses that had 10 employees than try to bring in one business that had 100, right? Because it allowed for much more diversity of innovation and practical application in his community. But one of the things that was really fantastic about it, and just thinking about this question of how to be innovative in entrepreneurship, was the sort of this network approach that was happening in DeWitt, in which several key players in the ecosystem, including an individual that's a fellow with our organization, was able to identify the camelina plant as an opportunity for DeWitt and the community. So Camelina is a biofuel source, right? And so what they were able to do was organize a series of farmers and entrepreneurs in DeWitt to really leverage this opportunity for the community. So they did a lot of architecting in terms of how do we recapitalize some of these farmers so that they have the kind of equipment that will make it more viable for them to plant the seed, and really did a lot of the work to develop relationships where they were able to have real business partnership and procurement opportunities with DoD and other opportunities. But this was really a community effort, right? It did not happen because of one single entrepreneur coming to the table, which is oftentimes the imagination, but there really was a collective effort within this community, and I was just blown away by the level of innovation. That's just one example, but it was innovation and community partnership that was really alive in DeWitt. The other thing that I would bring up too, as many of us recognize, in the U.S. in particular, we're moving towards being a majority people of color country. And I bring this up because when we look at some of the barriers to entrepreneurship and innovation, it's particularly going to continually create exclusion for folks of color and communities of color in this country, in communities of color that are in rural, which is something that we oftentimes don't think about. There's a lot of overlap. And so I bring this up because as we move forward, what are some of the things that we need to do to recognize, for example, we're talking about friends and family to support innovation and entrepreneurship in communities where there might not be friends and family capital. So how are we looking at that? How are we addressing those kind of opportunities and creating solutions around it? And then just finally, I just wanted to, because it came up in conversation, to think about some of the ways that venture capital has come up. And I was just in Denver with Victor a couple of weeks ago, and I had this realization, and it's not just that, I think all of us have thought about this, but when we think about some of the ways that venture capital has worked, it's really pursuing a monopoly approach, right? Market dominance, market share, capitalization and such that you can dominate the market. And I say this is also as an entrepreneur. I founded the Impact Hub in Baltimore, which is a co-working space to create social innovation and build a community. It's also a network, and the Impact Hub in DC closed not too long ago. And not because of simply the growth of WeWork, but in part because of, right? And so we're actually seeing when a lot of these spaces that were created specifically to serve and be a community gathering place for entrepreneurs and all sorts of places that otherwise could not afford real estate in their communities are really challenged right now, right? Because they're competing with an entity that at last I checked, SoftBank was considering another $10 billion investment. So what does it look like if you're in Cincinnati or you're in Oakland or you're in Detroit or in these communities when you don't have that kind of capitalization? And that's just one example, right? That's really how it's impacting communities when you look at not just the sort of the government side of the regulatory system, but also how capital and as terms of venture capital is also having a huge influence.
Thanks, Rodney. And you talk about sort of community empowerment and empowering entrepreneurs from the ground up. But I sort of wanted to take that thought and expand it across this whole panel, which is, we ask people to start businesses, and when they are able to turn a little business into a big business, we're happy for them. That's success. That's the American dream. Yet at some point they become too big. Facebook and Amazon, Google, not that long ago were little startup companies, and now and they were fighting the man, and they were trying to change the system and open up the markets. And now we look at them and say, in often cases, they're exerting a lot of power against new entrepreneurs. When does a company grow from cool, great, ambitious startup company to actually tip over to becoming too big? And because I think that's a relevant question to how we design public policy and think about this question. So I'm interested in your takes on that.
I would say a company's too big when they start reducing competition and limiting new entries into a marketplace, when they become unfair in their behavior. So
can you give an example of that, maybe from your ranching work or farming work?
Yeah, in 1978, when I built my first feedlot in St. Francis, Kansas, I had 20 potential buyers that could buy our finished cattle. On a Monday morning, you would typically see a cattle buyer at 6 o'clock parked outside our front gate sleeping in his car because he wanted a first shot at our show list, what we called our show list, which were the cattle that were available that week for purchase. And so there was a lot of competition, and at all levels of the industry were making positive margins back in those days in 1978. So the cow-calf guy was getting 70% of the consumer dollar. The middlemen were profitable from the feedlots to the slaughterhouses, and the end guys at the retail level were also profitable. And so we had a competitive system that really worked. Then by 1998, I had 0 buyers. Nobody left to buy my cattle. They'd been put out of business. The smaller guys put out of business by the big guys, and so we end up with Tyson, JBS, and Cargill, National with a small 4th position in the market, and I had no buyers. None of them would buy my cattle, partly because I was speaking out against the market concentration at the time. But when these companies get so big that they can act unfairly in the marketplace and get away with it, that's too big. And I love to talk about solutions, and I also want to emphasize the difference. I talk about this a lot, is the difference between economic development and community development. You know, in Colorado Springs, which was really the center of that book, Fast Food Nation, that Eric Schlosser wrote back in the late 90s, 98, 99 time frame, talked about this city in Colorado that loved chains and big boxes and had policy that really promoted big versus small. And that's where I'm at. That's where our business is. And so I fight this culture. And just to inspire a little bit, our last city council election put 3 new people on that, well, 1 existing that got to stay, and 2 additional new members that believe in community development. So this next city council election, we need to finish that job and make this city have a different culture. And I think there's a lot of possibility of that happening.
Yep. Lillian.
I have 2 comments, graveyards and margins. Graveyards, go and look at who went under. I've always said that. I've been to the government, I've been on the Hill for 20 years saying, go and look in that. Who all was making blood gas equipment? Who were the leaders making the bags that fluids that go in? There's 1 company now. When I started my first company, you go to trade shows, you'd see 20 suppliers on every level of people that sell into the medical device market. You see 1 or 2. Sometimes none, and we have to import from China. We have lost our technological edge on all this, because the other thing is with margins, it makes it so it doesn't pay to innovate. Why would you innovate? You own the market. In the healthcare market today, there's a reason that we pay 3 times more than any other country. I sell syringes today. I looked at a purchase order last night just to make sure I was giving you truth today. For a Brazilian bid, I charge 1/3 of what I charge when I sell to the District of Columbia. Because guess what? They have competitive bidding in Brazil. They can control their costs. In this country, we pay 3 times more. And you can see that by going to look at the margins for people like Abbott, Becton Dickinson, Merck, Pfizer. You want to see where your healthcare costs? Look at their margins. Look at their stock prices. The problem is we as a country don't want to give up how those stocks are doing in our 401ks and our mutual funds. We're not willing to have those hard conversations. That's why we're not going to fix healthcare, and we're going to be sitting here talking about this 10 years from now.
I've spent time in the life sciences entrepreneurship sector, and there's sort of a widespread knowledge amongst people in that business that the innovation pipeline is broken for entrepreneurs. So we may get great innovations as consumers, but the entrepreneurs almost always got squeezed out in the process, and they almost got nothing usually for the innovations they brought to market. I wanted to provide sort of an example, sort of a counterexample to see what happens, and this is the idea of big businesses and how big businesses behave. One of the aspects of the Silicon Valley story that not everyone knows is that one of the great reasons Silicon Valley started was because HP, the dominant company of Silicon Valley for its time, actually worked really well with small businesses. People would leave the company, they'd become suppliers, they'd cycle in and out through the company. Why doesn't that happen as much? And I've sort of put that in the context of thinking about when a business goes from small to big, and its behavior changes, is it even possible to have businesses that can provide that kind of support for the entrepreneurs in a community like HP was back then?
I can just speak to the medical device market, and I always say I'm from Texas, and you don't dance with somebody who can eat you, you know? So, no, they don't. They do not allow you to survive. It's an unfair bargaining position, and that's why the government's role is so important, is to make us have a healthy market so we can compete. And it's a public health concern for people in the medical device industry and the pharma industry. We are going to have a big public health crisis in this country, and we are not going to have the suppliers in this country that can handle it, because we have one or two suppliers in almost every sector of the biosciences and the medical device industry.
So really quickly, Victor, I'm gonna try to answer your current question, but I want to try to address the question prior. So right behind you, the open market's a tagline: liberty, democracy, prosperity. And to the question of when you become too large, I think it gets to the question of the democratic process. So if you become so large that you can, as an entity, influence government regulation, right? Can influence tax policy. That's when you become too large, right? And I think that's a part of the conversation that needs to be addressed, because the kind of communities and entrepreneurs that we work with have to really do a lot to come to the table to get recognized by government, to get recognized, to get resourced. You know, if you're a large entity, you get tax cuts, you get tax policy in your favor. And we talk about small businesses, but the definition of small, I think the folks here, is a lot different than oftentimes is considered small. And then a second to your question, Victor, I think what Mike was saying about that distinction between economic and community development is really important. I think it's really a challenging time for, in terms of these bigger companies and hoping for the best, right, that they're going to do as HP did. But then there's opportunities I see quite a bit, particularly there are opportunities, for example, for hospitals and others that are really geared toward public good, in terms of being able to provide, leveraging their infrastructure to support small businesses, particularly in communities like Baltimore and Cincinnati, et cetera. I've worked with a number of them, whether it's changing their procurement processes or setting up investment opportunities where they're able to leverage their footprint. When you look at, say Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, you're talking about $1.2 billion of spend, right? And so how do you leverage that to catalyze local business and new innovation and entrepreneurship that can start in a single place, but can then go into other communities and other areas? So, that's sort of that, looking at that intersection between community and economic development, and I think there's got to be really smart regulation to be able to influence that.
Alex, any thoughts on that?
I don't have I guess I have a lot of thoughts, but I wanted to address your previous question also, because I'm wrestling with this as we're discussing this, the question of, is there a size at which you're too big and you should be broken up? And I think it really is dependent on the type of business you're running. There are other examples in other industries of large businesses that I don't at least think routinely we believe should be broken up, that function quite well. Matt Stoller and I discussed this last night at dinner, but the New York Stock Exchange, which I don't argue is like a bastion for compassionate care, but at least regulated since the stock crash in 1929, has provided transparency and access for public market investors, and has held public company directors accountable. Now, the Justice Department and the FTC have not necessarily followed through in terms of holding people accountable, but the mechanisms exist. I think you could argue that people who are maintaining and making markets can scale to be quite big, and if they are properly regulated, both by regulators, by codes, by standards, we don't need to constrain them. We can make sure that they act fairly to provide access for everybody, and that, the response to Google might be to break it up, the response to Amazon might be to break it up, or the response may be to regulate. Mark Walsh, who's sitting here in the front, ran a company when I first met him called Vertical Net, which was a market maker for industry, sort of eBay for large industry. That's the kind of thing that works best at scale, and as long as you allow everybody access to that market and don't charge them unfair prices to get access to buyers, that's the kind of thing that is best achieved at a big scale. So I think I don't think we should narrowly think about the size of a company and whether there is competition for that one company's existence as to whether or not it should exist or shouldn't exist. But we should be thinking about that in conjunction with that company's, what is it enabling among other businesses and access and equity.
So the idea of making markets is different from making the products themselves that sell on those markets.
I think that's my instinct.
Yeah.
Or intuition.
Yeah, Mike?
Victor, on the food side, many of you have heard of a company called Chipotle, who I thought came up with the most brilliant marketing campaign ever, Food with Integrity. But the problem is that as they continued with that Food with Integrity, and we sold them product in the Colorado Springs, Denver region, and it was a very, very good relationship and a profitable relationship for us and them. There became a divide between the messaging and the operations, or sort of the marketing and the operations. And I think as their business grew and they got more advice from accountants and more pressure from investors to tighten operations up and to pay less and less for raw materials, we got a phone call on a Friday. We had 22 Chipotles at the time. We got a call on a Friday saying we were finished, that they weren't buying from us anymore. And we were very interested in who replaced us. So I think it was Easter Sunday, and they were closed. And one of our folks from Ranch Foods Direct went by and looked in the dumpster and found those boxes from beef from Australia, coming in about 30% below our price. And so they start with this great concept of buying local, humanely raised, antibiotic-free, all that stuff, and then the operations just start going the other direction. And so this is just an example. We've seen it also in food service, food management. Compass owns Bon Appetit. Bon Appetit's really struggling. They get the kickbacks from Cisco and from the suppliers of Cisco, like Tyson and Smithfield and companies like that. And it's just really, really hard to stay on mission based upon what you're marketing as opposed to what makes the most money.
I guess if you go to, market theory or traditional market theory, they'd say, well, it's an open marketplace, it's freely competitive, entrepreneurs can compete on price just like everybody else, and if they can't compete on price, then they deserve not to win. But I want to go into that question of organizing entrepreneurs to actually negotiate and the challenges of bargaining when you've got a handful of big companies that can sort of shape the markets, and then entrepreneurs who are totally disorganized and disconnected. And Mike had a great comment right before. I asked him about ranchers, like why they don't organize to bargain, and he says because they're ranchers. And I wonder about just that issue of how can entrepreneurs be organized to actually have greater bargaining power?
My own experience with this, and I'm somebody who's very politically engaged and has always been, is that entrepreneurs are damn busy running their own businesses, and getting them organized to negotiate or to even to cooperate with their competitive entrepreneurs is a very difficult and uphill battle. Not many of them see it in their own interest, but it is never the most urgent thing to do. And the urgent, on a good day you get to do something that's important and urgent, and most days you just do what's urgent when you're running a small business. So, this is really where government has to step in and negotiate or act on the behalf of the entrepreneur. And so you can get an entrepreneur to sign up to be a part of a coalition, but getting the getting the entrepreneur to walk around the halls of Congress or in their state legislature, I think would be is a more difficult task.
They're too busy hustling to have their voice heard.
I really appreciate that comment for a couple of reasons. One is I've been that entrepreneur trying to help organize other entrepreneurs, and it's just not possible. Everybody's so busy when you're running your business. Once you are able to get, like, we have a medical device trade association, the big guys co-opt it because you need those $25,000 a year memberships. A small company doing $5 million a year, they can afford maybe a $1,000 membership. You need $25,000 memberships to have somebody walk the halls of Congress. Guess who you're going to get it from? The big guys. That's no longer a group of small entrepreneurs. Secondly, I served in the government. I was always, quite frankly, naive, and I felt not betrayed, but I just didn't know it worked that way, even though I was a lawyer and a business person and thought I knew something. I didn't realize that when you say access, the type of access big business has. I worked at the Department of Agriculture. Mike knows what I'm talking about. When they come in, I always tried to make it, and I sort of was ridiculed and chided about it, but if a lobbyist or a big company came in to speak to me as a deputy undersecretary, I asked if I could allow anybody else in the country that had asked about that issue to be on the speakerphone. Because I'm a public servant. Shouldn't everybody get that same information? That's not how it works. So everything we're talking about here today is about political power. Because as much as I rail on the FTC, I know how hard they have it. Because if they go after one of these big companies, someone on the Hill is going to call them, and somebody's going to get removed from that position. That's how it works. We all know it. That's the real problem.
I've been to chambers of commerce meetings across the country and economic development councils, and what struck me is how few entrepreneurs are engaged in those things. It's always the big industries, the big players in town. They're the most active chamber members, and the little startups, they're too busy. But now, Rodney, you've been doing this work at the local level, and you're actually able to get entrepreneurs to do stuff together. What's the difference?
So part of it is, and Victor, to be honest, there needs to be alternative opportunities. So Bali actually came about as an alternative to the Chamber of Commerce initially. And really being able to engage, and I'm thinking about Local First Arizona is one of the kind of champions in our network that really gets actively involved and engages and mobilizes entrepreneurs at the local level in a tremendously powerful way, right? But it's also led by an entrepreneur, right? That built small businesses and the kinds of businesses that reflect the network. And I think that's part of the challenge, is being able to have people in those seats that actually understand the day-to-day grind and challenges that it had to be an entrepreneur, particularly in a community like in Phoenix or somewhere like in Jackson, Mississippi, right? And so I think that's one of the things, is really having some clear-eyedness in terms of how do we actually, the people in the seats that are advocating for these sort of things. And I also wanted to point out that the whole conversation about winners and losers and let's go with market theory. The reality is the people in this room, we're all losing because of monopolization, right? So we're thinking about like healthcare costs, all these sort of things. That's where, again, how do we make sure that there's an active engagement from policy in a way that truly is in the interest of the smallest level of entrepreneurship? Because if you can do that, then you open up things in remarkable ways. And the reality is, not just on the Hill, but in city halls in Baltimore and other places, it's remarkably difficult for entrepreneurs to engage with politicians.
Why is that?
Well, the reality is, so for example, several years ago, I hosted I've done a lot of political fundraising and these sort of things in Baltimore City, and hosted something for some city councilmen. And was surprised, and I was doing this and really actively engaging around the tech inclusive tech space. And the council people were saying, well, they don't vote, and they don't put money into our campaigns. Right? And so that's the reality. And so there's because of that unwillingness to get the hands dirty to do that kind of stuff, which is again the problem. right? And so there's a big part of that, and that's happening not just on the Hill, it's happening in state houses across the country, where, you know, if you're a small entrepreneur and a group of entrepreneurs and you're saying, hey, I've got to put up $5,000 to get noticed. So it's not just paying the trade association. So a lot of this has to do with the political process, I think. And again, that's why I underscore, you know, democracy, right? And this whole conversation, because when you have these large businesses that can single-handedly influence the direction of regulation in this country, that's a problem, right? And it's a problem for all of us. It's not just something that is impacting entrepreneurs and small businesses. We all feel the impacts of it. And so I think when you talk about mobilizing entrepreneurs, I think the question is, do you have policymakers? And if you're doing a trade association, for example, that really can get in the seat and see what is happening and can have the best interest of someone like Mike, that's the conversation I think we need to be having.
So one of the things we've been doing more and more of at the Kauffman Foundation is actually finding entrepreneurs and bringing them into state houses and into Congress to actually talk about the experience of being an entrepreneur. But that's a heavy lift for us, right? We have to go identify people, or we have to support folks who can do that. We have to move entrepreneurs physically into these places.
We can help you with that, Victor.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. There's got to be a better way, right? What can be done to help get the voices of entrepreneurs heard in the policy discussions?
It's a dollar for dollar thing is the problem. Unfortunately, our politics are still so money dependent that even politicians that are going to come speak to us today, they're awesome, but they have to have donations. And that entrepreneur, even if he goes in the State House and we drag him from one of his round tables and brings him over, he's not going to be able to make that $5,000 or $10,000 or $2,500 donation on a regular basis. And he or she may not be employing the 3,000 people in that congressman's district. And those 3,000 people that are employed in that congressman's district are who gets to weigh in. And those are normally not small entrepreneurs.
I'm not a Pollyanna about, and I don't want to understate the role that money plays in corrupting our politics, but I also think that there is, it is a potentially very popular and position for a politician to take. Maybe not the Congress people representing the city of Seattle or the specific places where these businesses are headquartered. But there are lots of towns and small cities across this country that have been devastated by monopoly power. And there are people there who are struggling, who are either entrepreneurs or used to work at companies that have been defeated or beaten back by entrepreneurs who do vote. And so I'm not as pessimistic about the opportunity for politicians to get powerful and quite popular by attacking big business and by trying to enact policy that will protect smaller businesses. This has been, Victor, as you said in your opening remarks, this is what America has been about from the very beginning. Yeoman farmers and entrepreneurs, and I think there are a lot of politicians, frankly, on both sides of the aisle, who share that intuition and desire to protect and help small businesses. So I think, and there is gaining momentum around that, politically speaking, on both sides of the aisle to protect the interests of small businesses. So I think we need to arm them with policy. We need to, when I say it's difficult to organize volunteers, it's difficult to organize volunteers to devote time or money to something, but devoting their name and commitments to support certain policies and to vote, I think is an easier task. And if the Chamber of Commerce is not representing the interests of small business, and I certainly don't believe they are, then perhaps we need a new organization to represent the interests of small business across industry, so that you can get thousands of $1,000 checks and you're not reliant on specific industries to fund your specific interests. The nice thing about these policies is that they are in many cases, cross-cutting across industry. And so you can attract entrepreneurs who are struggling against monopoly power in many different places and in many different sectors.
Yeah, Mike? And Mike, you're unique because you're actually like in the heat of you are an entrepreneur now. You're running a business now.
Right.
And you're spending all this time here in DC involved in policy matters. I mean, what does it take to get people like you and people more like you involved?
Well, I am unique. I've got good people that run my businesses, and so I can get away. And I've got a business that makes money. It's called the Callicrate banner. It's like Lillian. I invented a medical device for humane, bloodless, drug-free castration. It sells around the world, employs about 50 people in St. Francis, Kansas, and it makes the money so I can fight for farmers and ranchers and a better, more sustainable, what I'd like to call a regenerative food system. And so, you know, Rodney, you hit it. You nailed it when you said everyone in this room is the loser. You know, since I started feeding cattle in 1978, and I told you that the producer receives 70% of the consumer meat dollar, we are now down to 38% of the consumer meat dollar, having lost nearly half our ranchers, 95% of our hog farmers, 90% of our dairymen, and we are a net food importer on a value basis. This is crazy. How many of you knew that? How many of you knew that rural America was dying the way that it is? I would love to repeal Citizens United. That would be a really big help. And what Lillian says about the organizations, and Alex, you said about Chamber of Commerce, absolutely they're against us. You know, it's Wall Street versus Main Street. And I would argue too that Wall Street is really inversely related to Main Street. What's good for Wall Street often is very bad for Main Street. And so Lillian talked about organizations being co-opted. I mean, look at the National Cattlemen's Beef Association claiming to represent ranchers. Meanwhile, 87,000 feedlots are out of business and nearly half our ranchers. National Pork Producers, that represents Smithfield and Seaboard and the biggest pig companies in the country. You saw their operations, Smithfield's operations in South Carolina, North Carolina during Florence. That's where your pork is coming from. And so I'm really lucky to have what I have. But I could tell you, I've never seen anything as hard as being in the food business. And I've done a lot of entrepreneurial things in my life, but I mean, we have to whip this one. And I've got ideas on how to fix it. And Alex, I like the utilities model. We've lost our infrastructure. Let's build local regional food systems that are publicly owned, giving producers, farmers, young people that want to get into farming, fair access to the one market they can't access today, and that is the United States domestic market. We do not have access. So I'm saying as people who want to invest wisely, let's put our tax dollars into infrastructure, local food utility infrastructure, with the end being the public market. And for those of you who have ever been to the Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia, that's what I'm talking about. Now you talk about entrepreneurship, that place has got 70, at last count, 72 entrepreneurs working under that roof, paying affordable rents, not some developer jacking the rent on them every time they post a positive profit. Combine that with infrastructure for processing. I'm talking cheese making and milling, slaughter the animals where they're at, but haul the carcasses in, put it all behind glass, and let the public see how that food is processed and comes to their plate.
Yeah, Lillian.
First, Mike's great, and I love everything he said. But back to Alex, I think what you're describing is exactly what we need more. There's such great people that know how to organize on political levels. I mean, how to do it for entrepreneurs. The problem we have in DC is, I'm sure there's somebody in the room that's going to disagree, and that's okay. But for 20 years, when I would come up here before I was a political official or ran for Congress or anything, and I would say, who represents small business? I mean, in earnest, I would look. There was no one. Right now, who does the Senate Small Business Committee call in to testify? Who does the House Small Business person asked to testify. It's not the NFIB that gives you a little plaque and you pay $50 and they're all good people. There's not a deal about not good people, or the National Small Business Association. It's just these DC organizations that they don't represent people like Mike or my little company in Texas. That's not what they do. We need something that's very mobile, cheap, represents people of color. I've been asked to be on those small business committees more times because I just show up here and they feel sorry for me, so they let me talk. They don't do anything, but they let me talk. But there needs to be where they know if they don't listen to those groups, they're going to come and vote them out, or they're going to come and run somebody against them. There's got to be a way that the small business folks are able to have a seat to decide with the FTC commissioners what they investigate. The problem we have now is everyone's directed by the guys with the power, the monopolists.
Victor, can I say one quick? I know you're going to. So just really quickly, because I want to highlight the stuff that's happening in Local First Arizona as an example with, when we talk about infrastructure, there's so much infrastructure in communities around political organizing, right? What I find, though, and what Local First Arizona has figured out is how to marry the interest of what's happening in small business and entrepreneurship as a community development challenge, right? And so having these kind of pairings where instead of entrepreneurs having to organize, figuring out what the case making is for these other entities that are already organizing on the ground and figuring out things to position at their state houses otherwise, because they're trying to figure out how to have more inclusive economic development and community development happening. But the entrepreneurship and small business conversation doesn't happen as often. So what Local First Arizona has been able to do is integrate those two conversations, and they're having more success because of it. So just thinking about how do we actually leverage the existing infrastructure in political places, that's one model that I've seen to be really effective.
There's a theme that cuts throughout all this, which is that markets left to their own devices naturally skew right towards incumbents and big. And then entrepreneurs are too busy to have a voice in this, and they're too scattered, and they're too busy hustling to make their businesses work. And so I think probably the one note of optimism, despite all the challenges, is that there are ways to actually shape the markets, and that we should intentionally shape markets to make them open and accessible to the new businesses that are entering them. And I think that is going to be the challenge of the coming years, to figure out how do we do that better and better. I want to thank these panelists who've been amazing. Thank you for sharing your stories and your passion and energy.